Former child star Gary Coleman, who shot to fame on TV sitcom Different Strokes, died in a Utah hospital.
Diminutive actor Gary Coleman was a worldwide superstar. In the 1980s, his chubby cheeks, sharp wit, and trademark catchphrase captured the hearts of millions.
In the constellation of child stars, he shone the brightest.
But at the height of his fame, he was plagued by health problems.
Endless doctors, endless hospitalizations.
And as his career stalled, he hit the headlines for all the wrong reasons.
Filing bankruptcy was my only reasonable alternative.
He gained a reputation as a notorious hothead, and a series of highly publicized arrests followed.
Gary, what happened yesterday?
People didn't let him be. His anger increased.
And on May 28, 2010, Gary Coleman died after an incident at his home in Utah. Wild speculation immediately began to circulate.
And there's still not a really clear answer to how he fell and how there was so much blood involved.
I actually feared for Gary's safety.
Gary's life seemed filled with conflict and controversy, and it appears that his death was no different. But was his untimely death the result of one of his many health issues that blighted his life, or, as some believe, the result of something more sinister?
Dr. Michael Hunter is a world-renowned forensic pathologist. He's performed over 4,000 autopsies, and today he's the chief medical examiner in one of America's biggest cities. Working closely with law enforcement, Dr. Hunter specializes in unraveling the cause of suspicious deaths.
Gary Coleman died in mysterious circumstances. Is this the sad tale of a child star who went off the rails? Or is there more to the story? Using all of the available medical evidence and police reports, I'm going to build a picture of Gary's final days and hours and determine exactly what happened to him.
May 25th, 2010, Santa Quin, Utah, 3 days before Gary's death. Gary's at home playing with his model trains. This has been a hobby ever since he was a child.
There was no greater passion for Gary than his model trains. So he would very often find himself immersed for hours and hours, creating another space, another kingdom for his model railroad, and that was his ultimate joy.
Gary is living with his ex-wife, Shannon Price, 18 years his junior. The couple married in 2007, only to divorce a year later. But despite their rocky romance, they continue to stay together. In recent years, acting work has dried up for Gary, and mounting medical bills following a series of health problems have left him nearly bankrupt.
An initial glance through Gary's medical history tells me he was plagued by a number of health issues for most of his life. Determining which, if any, contributed to his death won't be easy.
Gary Wayne Coleman was born in Zion, Illinois on February 8, 1968. His parents, W.G. Coleman and Edmonia Sue, hailed from humble beginnings in the rural Deep South. The couple worked together in the laundry at a Chicago hospital, putting themselves through night school to give their son a better start in life.
Well, it's that time of the year when you can get a Hubert doll at the Harris Bank.
Young Gary showed early promise as a performer, and in 1977, at the age of 9, he was cast in a commercial for a Chicago-based bank.
Gary was actually discovered by a talent scout who was working for Norman Lear.
You know, you can never have too many Hubert dolls, 'cause...
Norman saw the footage and said, I've got to get that kid to Hollywood. And that is exactly how Gary was discovered.
Within a year, Gary had been handpicked for the lead role in the new NBC sitcom, Different Strokes. Gary played Arnold Jackson, one of two brothers taken in by a rich white businessman after their mother died. His impossibly cute face and comic timing made him an instant hit, and he quickly became the star of the show.
He was so funny. He had this wide smile, these chipmunk cheeks, and he was just adorable. And then he would say something, and you just bust a gut laughing.
The most striking thing about Gary is his height. As an adult, he was only 4'8". And people who are this short typically have a genetic condition called achondroplasia, also known as short-limb dwarfism. Adults with this condition have a normal lifespan, but they can have problems with their brain and spinal cord. But looking closer at his body, it seems in proportion, so there needs to be another reason to explain his unusual height. And I believe I found that. Gary's early childhood appears to have started normally, but by 22 months, I could see that he was diagnosed with nephritis, and this is a potentially fatal congenital kidney disease. This was caused by his ureters becoming blocked, and these are tubes that allow urine to flow from the kidney to the bladder. This obstruction caused urine to flow back into the kidneys, and this completely destroyed one and severely damaged the second. Without a kidney transplant, Gary would not have lived much longer.
December 18th, 1973. Gary is 5 years old. After 2 years of waiting, a donor kidney has finally been found. He undergoes a 7-hour operation to have it transplanted.
That is just a challenge that most people can't even relate to. But when you're a young child facing that kind of horror, it's unending. It's with you every day.
The kidney transplant was a success, but it meant that he had to take powerful immunosuppressant drugs to keep his body from rejecting his new organ.
One time he commented to somebody that he takes so many pills, he was surprised he didn't rattle when he walked.
I can see that one of the drugs he was taking was prednisone. This is a steroid that contains cortisol, and too much of this over a long period of time can cause the cheeks to puff, something we call Cushing syndrome or moon face. Also, more importantly, steroids taken at a young age, particularly in people who have kidney failure, can stunt their growth. Healthy bones contain growth plates, and these allow the bones to lengthen throughout childhood. So when the kidneys cease to function, calcium metabolism is disrupted, causing these growth plates to close prematurely and the bones to stop growing. I don't believe that the side effects of the medication Gary took or his restricted height had anything to do with his death. But the combination of his nephritis and the powerful steroids he took explain his short stature and his unique look. If Gary had healthy kidneys, he would have grown to a normal height.
And it was Gary's small stature, chubby cheeks, and ability to play a character much younger than his years that propelled him to superstardom.
He became the star because he had this ability to say a line that would just lay everybody out. It was a self-taught genius.
By 1981, Gary had become NBC's highest-paid comedy actor, reportedly raking in around $70,000 per episode. Gary's parents gave up their jobs to manage their son and paid themselves 20% of his earnings. The show was a huge success, but behind the scenes, the cracks were starting to appear. 1983, Metromedia Square Studios. Gary is 15 years old, but he's becoming increasingly frustrated with playing a younger character, the mounting pressures of fame, and his failing health.
Gary himself was carrying the show. He was everyone's meal ticket, and he knew it. He was fed up with being tutored on set. He wanted to go to a regular school. He wanted to be like a normal kid.
Gary wanted to stop working. He didn't want to go home in the next season, and his parents made him do it. They said, just do one more, and then that'll be it.
If Gary said that he was going to stop working, then that meant an extreme diminishment of income for a lot of people who he made very rich.
Gary was clearly under stress during the filming of Different Strokes. He was working hard, and he took on enormous responsibilities for someone so young. And I found something in his medical history that tells me that his kidney issues were a recurring problem throughout his life. We know that Gary received a donor kidney at the age of 5. So what I want to know is, why was he on dialysis in the weeks just prior to his death?
May 26, 2010, Utah Valley Hospital. 8 a.m., 2 days before Gary's death. Gary is at his regular 4-hour dialysis session.
Dialysis works by cleaning the blood of impurities. It acts as a mechanical kidney. Blood is drawn into the machine and waste products are filtered out. The purified blood is then pumped back into the body. I know that Gary received a donor kidney when he was 5, but I can see that when he was 14 and at the height of his fame, his transplanted kidney failed. He then needed self-dialysis before another organ could be found for him.
But there was no let-up for Gary, who continued to work long hours on the show.
In the sitcom business, you have to work a long day, 15 hours a day. And because he quickly became the star, he had to push himself probably more than his doctor would have wanted him to do.
In 1984, Gary received a second transplant, but it only lasted for 13 months. And on New Year's Eve in 1985, he had to have that kidney surgically removed. This meant that Gary had no kidney function, and it explains why he was on dialysis just days before his death.
Gary was so broken about having lost that second kidney, was not at all receptive to taking another chance. He did not feel that science had moved far enough along to guarantee he wouldn't have to say goodbye to another kidney.
Losing a transplanted organ is hugely traumatic, and Gary went through this twice, and so this must have been so hard for him, because the alternative that he opted for, dialysis for the rest of his life, it's a real testament to the loss that he must have felt when those 2 transplants didn't go right.
From that point onwards, Gary did receive dialysis for the rest of his life.
From when I knew him, he was having dialysis 3 times a week. And everything was predicated on the dialysis. He really didn't complain about those things. He put up with what he had to put up with, which was an interesting part of his personality. He didn't look to get sympathy.
When we started shooting with Gary and he was fresh out of dialysis, we got the best Gary you could possibly get. Energetic, vibrant. He was fully ready to go. And then you'd see the decline.
But dialysis is not a long-term solution. The average life expectancy for someone on it is from 5 to 10 years, and Gary's been dependent for over 25 years. Toxins build in the bloodstream, and then they're distributed to all the vital organs in the body. If those organs are damaged or cease to function over time, it's game over.
Every 3 days for his entire life, he sat there with, an open tube in his chest and having to go through dialysis. And that's got to be massively difficult to live with.
Infection is another risk of dialysis because it requires frequent access to the bloodstream. People on long-term dialysis tend to have surgically created vascular channels in order to allow easy access to the bloodstream. This is because the veins would collapse after numerous needle injections. This method also carries less risk of infection. And as Gary was on dialysis for 25 years, this is the form of vascular access that I would expect him to be on. However, in 2009, a year before his death, Gary was fitted with a catheter, and this is a method of short-term access, not normally recommended to be used for more than 3 weeks. I have no information why this was done, but I suspect it's because Gary's surgically created vascular channel failed, and the short-term catheter was his only reasonable alternative.
He was always hypersensitive about making sure that everything and everyone was clean so as not to contract any kind of infection. That was always of serious concern to him.
Studies have shown that patients that use the catheter method as opposed to other techniques to gain access to the blood are at much higher risk of dying from infection. Bacteria, like the drug-resistant superbug MRSA, can travel along the catheter and into the bloodstream, resulting in a life-threatening situation.
Did a deadly complication due to Gary's long-term dialysis lead him to collapse, strike his head, and ultimately cause his death?
In 2009, Gary had a very bad infection from his dialysis catheter, and that never really went away. It was painful, and it was just always bothering him.
You had to be very careful. I mean, once he was doing a film in Texas and he had to use and he got ill. He got an infection which lasted weeks.
Although Gary had a number of infections over the years because of his dialysis, there is nothing in the medical information that suggests his death was somehow related to a catheter-associated infection or any other complication. It's clear that Gary took his dialysis very seriously, and without it, he would have died at a much younger age.
It was something that he had to do to stay alive. That there was just no debate about that.
May 26, 2010, 12:40 p.m. Drained and tired from his 4-hour dialysis session, Gary returns home to find his partner Shannon in bed watching TV.
One of the many complications of having no functioning kidneys is the increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Stress is also a major contributing factor for heart disease, and we know that Gary was under an immense amount of pressure.
As Gary's popularity soared, so did his workload. The schedule was backbreaking.
He wasn't just working on different strokes. Gary worked year-round. He basically worked non-stop while still having to address his physical limitations and his health concerns, and it was absolutely daunting, to say the least.
Gary's frustrations reached an all-time high, and he began to demand more input into his character.
Gary became much more verbal about his displeasure, about feeling rather caged. He wanted to have more of a creative voice in the process of the show, in the storylines of the show.
Gary was playing a character much younger than his real age. So while in real life he's growing, emotionally and physically, on screen he's kind of stunted. This would have created a huge amount of internal conflict, being a young adult but being seen as a child by everyone around you.
Gary's insistence on playing his real age saw ratings plummet, and in 1986, Different Strokes was canceled.
When Different Strokes ended, Gary wanted to retire from show business. He was completely burned.
Finding fame at a young age and having to deal with that amplified self-awareness, that, that notion of not having a private and personal self is something that can be really damaging, not just at the time, but later on as an adult as well. For a child actor, when the work that they're doing is no longer fun, but there's people around him or her that are pressuring them into doing it, then, resentment grows up. That feeling of missing out on their childhood can manifest in a sense of, the hell with it.
But it wasn't just the pressures of being a child star that took their toll on Gary. When Different Strokes ended, he was estimated to have amassed a fortune worth a staggering $18 million.
When Gary turned 18, a lot of the money that Gary expected to see in his own accounts were not there.
Gary believed his parents and advisors cheated him out of his hard-earned money.
I think Gary's parents, probably like anybody, didn't have the foresight that, hey, we need to set money aside because someday this money train is going to stop.
In 1993, Gary successfully sued his parents. But after legal costs, he reportedly walked away with less than $500,000.
Gary ultimately took his parents to court believing that they had mismanaged his money. This would have been so heartbreaking for him. These are the people that in his mind had his back. You know, if we can't trust the people closest to us, this punctuates our relationships, not just professionally, but also personally going forward.
But Gary's financial problems were only the start. His relentless health issues continued to spiral dangerously out of control.
I know from Gary's medical history that he had an enlarged heart, and he had to have major surgery because of this.
October 2009, Utah Valley Hospital, 1 year before his death. Gary is undergoing open-heart surgery to replace his aortic valve. It's a long and complicated procedure.
Gary had actually several rounds of open-heart surgery that most people don't know about.
People with renal failure have excess fluid in their bodies that would otherwise be eliminated by the kidneys. The heart has to work a lot harder to pump the blood and excess fluid around the body. And like a muscle, it grows bigger, the valves weaken, and it increases the risk of sudden cardiac arrest. Replacing the aortic valve was his only option.
It was just endless doctors, endless hospitalizations, and these things were expensive. This was why he needed so much to keep working in show business to pay for his insurance.
Gary clearly suffered from a number of heart problems, but I can find no mention in the medical notes that he suffered from a heart attack because of his enlarged heart. Therefore, I don't believe that Gary's cardiovascular problems were directly related to his death. But I found something else in Gary's past that is cause for concern, and it raises big questions about his mental state.
April 18th, 2009, 13 months before his death. After a vicious fight with Shannon, Gary makes an impulsive decision, leaving her no choice but to call the police.
When police came out, they found him in an upstairs bedroom, standing on his bed with an electrical cord tied to the bed and the other end of it wrapped around his neck 4 times. He said he wanted to kill himself. And when the police officer said, "No, let me help you, let me take that off you," Gary said, "No, let me die, I want to die, I want to die."
But this was not the first time Gary tried to kill himself.
The pressures of Gary's life did become insurmountable from time to time. And if I remember correctly, he was about 13 or 14 years old when he made his first attempt at suicide. It was just more than he could bear to get up every morning and face the struggles with his health, along with the pressures of being Arnold Jackson.
Escalating health troubles were not Gary's only concern. Acting work dried up, and his finances hit rock bottom.
I didn't expect you guys at 3 o'clock in the morning.
No, I know. We were here for Nicole Richie, but you're a bigger star than Nicole.
No, Nicole actually worked a lot more often than I did.
He would have loved to have worked more, but, there are not that many roles for him.
When Gary was 31 years old, he was forced to make a tough and very public announcement.
Filing bankruptcy was my only reasonable alternative.
He was left with no option but to take a job as a security guard on a Hollywood movie set.
Gary talked about being a security guard, and he didn't have enough money, and he needed a job.
Yes, a cigar!
Doing something that had a purpose was important to him, and the massive ridiculing that he got for being a security guard from America was awful.
Man, get the fuck off our car!
People reacted to him as the iconic character of Arnold. I think he wanted to be not a known person at that point. just let me be, you know.
To go from being one of America's biggest stars to working as a security guard would have been hugely difficult for Gary. It would have affected his ego, his self-esteem. He wanted to be seen as the person he was, and he wanted to distance himself from this child character of Arnold Jackson. Yet, the public held him to that. All of these things kind of set up a perfect storm whereby whatever direction he looks in, he's depressed, he's not happy, and he wants out.
In 2010, child star Gary Coleman died after collapsing and striking his head at his Utah home. No one knows for certain how he sustained the killer blow. Now, forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Hunter is investigating and has uncovered evidence that Gary may have taken his own life.
I have already ruled out complications due to dialysis and heart problems being directly responsible for Gary's death. However, I've discovered that Gary has a history of suicide attempts that date back to 1982. I can see he made another attempt on his life in July of 2007. He called police and he told them that he'd taken an overdose of OxyContin and he wanted to die. OxyContin is a powerful prescription painkiller. It's an opiate like heroin, which means it's a depressant. If you take too many, the brain shuts down and the body forgets to breathe. Could Gary have taken so many pills that he'd passed out, fallen, and struck his head?
May 26th, 12:48 p.m., 2 days before his death. Shannon asks Gary to go downstairs and fix her some food. A short time after he leaves the room, she's startled by a loud bang and immediately goes to investigate. Shannon finds Gary collapsed on the kitchen floor, with blood trickling from his head. Sickened by the sight, she rushes back upstairs and quickly calls the emergency services. This is the actual audio from the 911 dispatch.
His head is bloody. There's blood all over the floor. I don't know what happened. I really don't know what happened. I just heard this bang and I went down there and he's on the floor.
1:05 p.m. After prompting from the 911 operator, Shannon goes back to the kitchen and gives Gary some towels to stem the bleeding.
And there's like blood all over and I can't really help him. I have seizures. If I get stressed out, I'm going to seize. I got blood on myself. I can't deal.
1:15 p.m. An officer from the Santaquin Police Department is first on the scene. He treats Gary's wound while he waits for paramedics. Gary is barely conscious and has no memory of what happened. 1:30 p.m. Gary's able to walk with assistance to the ambulance, where he's then rushed to the hospital and treated for his injuries.
Looking at the police statement, it says that Gary sustained a 2-inch laceration on the back of his head. And this is the type of injury that's very consistent with a simple fall. However, I do not believe that this fall had anything to do with Gary taking too many prescription painkillers, as I'm not able to find any mention of OxyContin in the investigative records. And more significantly, there are personal accounts following previous suicide attempts that make me believe that Gary never intended to take his own life.
Gary came up to me and he said, "Hey, I've taken a bunch of pills and I tried to commit suicide." So was that Gary reaching out for some attention? Yes, 100%. Did he actually take something that caused death? No. I think it was again, a cry out for help and feeding the depression that he lived in.
Was Gary's despondence really genuine? Absolutely. Was his hopelessness real? Absolutely. Did he really want to die? No.
I think suicide attempts should always be taken seriously. The notion that there's maybe a part of someone that still wants to live you know, it's certainly true for a lot of people, but to get to the point where the only way to communicate your unhappiness is to shout it that loud. You know, the notion that I'd rather be dead than feel the way that I do is something that he was, I think, saying loud and clear and saying over and over again.
May 27th, 12 p.m., 24 hours before his death. Gary has been recovering in the hospital for the past 24 hours, but doctors still have to closely monitor him.
At this stage, Gary was conscious and lucid, and he was recovering from his head injury. His current state would give me no real cause for concern.
4 p.m., 20 hours before his death. Gary's condition suddenly deteriorates, and he loses consciousness. At some point, he goes into cardiac arrest, and the crash team battle hard to save him. His heart is restarted, but Gary, now unable to breathe for himself, is placed on life support. Approximately 48 hours after Gary sustained a head injury, doctors inform his partner that he is brain dead, and there's nothing more they can do. Shortly before midday on May 28th, Shannon Price makes the decision to turn off his life support. At 12:11 p.m., Gary Coleman dies, with his partner Shannon and her family at his bedside.
Former child star Gary Coleman, who shot to fame on TV sitcom Different Strokes, died in a Utah hospital on Friday. He was 42.
I was at my London hotel. My phone rang, and it was Entertainment Tonight, wanting me to comment. I said, "What are you talking about?" "Well, he's in the hospital." And then in that conversation, she said, "Oh, he's died." Very surprising and very, very sad.
At the moment that I first learned of his passing, to say that I was devastated would be a gross understatement.
I was in my office and it was sad. It was really sad. It wasn't unexpected, but it was definitely sad.
Something was very, very wrong.
It's very surprising that Gary would go from a stable condition following a fall to dead within just a matter of days. So if I'm going to get to the bottom of the mystery of why Gary died, I need the answer to two specific questions. First, why did Gary's condition deteriorate so rapidly in the hospital? And second, why did Gary fall in the first place? To answer the first question, I've found an official document released by the hospital that states that he suffered from an intracranial hemorrhage, and that's bleeding on the brain. Tiny veins between the surface of the brain and its outer covering rupture, allowing blood to collect. The pressure builds, compressing brain tissue, and if not treated quickly, can lead to brain injury and death. Yet Gary did receive medical attention very quickly, and an intracranial hemorrhage is not a death sentence. So why did Gary die? I believe the answer to this relates to Gary's heart problem. After a major surgery like an aortic valve replacement, patients are typically placed on blood-thinning medications for the rest of their lives. And it's this that can turn even minor head injury into something that's fatal. The internal bleeding is much harder to control because the blood has an inability to clot. But I still don't know what caused the injury that ultimately led to Gary's death.
Some have pointed the finger of blame at the person with whom he was closest.
With her animosity and her domineering spirit, he would run away and retreat.
Their financial situation was extremely bleak. One could argue that he was worth a lot more to her dead than alive.
I've never forgiven her for pulling the plug. She had no right, and she did it very quickly.
To precisely understand how Gary died, I need to solve the mystery of how he got his fatal head wound.
Some believe the trauma was a result of a fight with his partner, Shannon. This wouldn't have been the first time the couple had come to blows.
It didn't stay happy very long. I mean, they fought like children.
The couple's rocky relationship led them to both being arrested for domestic assault.
Gary Coleman sits in the Utah County Jail tonight. He was arrested on a domestic violence assault-related charge.
She was strong, she was dominant. I think that was a piece of the relationship that was, maybe not the best for Gary, because he kind of let her control him.
After Gary died, wild rumors began to circulate. Even the national media were speculating on the cause of his death.
And there's still not a really clear answer to how he fell and how there was so much blood involved.
In the police report, it states that they questioned Shannon Price about the incident, and the officers searched the kitchen for any signs of foul play. Because there was head trauma, the medical examiner conducted an investigation but found nothing suspicious. Therefore, I'm going to rule out domestic violence as a cause of Gary's death. But I have finally found the clue I was looking for, and it comes from Gary himself in footage that was shot not long before he died. In it, he states that he was prescribed the medication Dilantin. That's an anti-seizure medication. In the same way a circuit breaker trips in the home when it's overloaded, seizures are caused by an electrical surge in the brain. Neurotransmitters fire off messages at a much higher rate. The brain can't cope and shuts down.
January 2010, 5 months before Gary's death. Gary is recovering in the hospital after suffering a seizure at a Los Angeles hotel. He was in town to promote what would be his last film.
He came out the next day, and he was really, really weak, and walking with a cane, and yeah, I could definitely see a decline in his health at that point.
Gary suffered another seizure in February of 2010, only 3 months before his death. This tells me that Gary has a seizure disorder, and this is not uncommon in people who have no kidney function.
After examining all the evidence, Dr. Hunter can finally piece together the story of Gary Coleman's last hours.
Gary returned home from his dialysis session, likely in a tired and weakened state. He goes downstairs to prepare a meal for his partner, Shannon. He begins to feel faint. Inside his brain, it's like an electrical storm of activity. Chemical messages are misfiring, and this imbalance leads to a seizure. Gary collapses, striking the back of his head on the hard kitchen floor. The sudden blow ruptures the skin and tears blood vessels that run along the surface of the brain. Blood begins to pool in the space between his skull and his brain. Gary is then taken to the hospital. He arrives conscious and lucid. But inside his skull, the blood thinners that he is most likely taking stopped his blood from clotting, and it continued to build. As the blood accumulates, it puts pressure on his brain. This limits oxygen-rich blood from reaching the brain tissue, causing additional swelling. As this continues, the brain starts to herniate, and without oxygen, it begins to die. Brain function rapidly decreases, and at some point, he goes into cardiac and respiratory arrest. Gary is now brain dead. Doctors would never have allowed Gary's life support to be turned off if there was any hope that he could have survived. The decision is made to remove Gary's ventilator, and at 12:11 p.m., he's dead.
Gary was a fighter. Gary wanted to live. Gary enjoyed his life. Challenges and all, he wasn't ready to let go.
We expect so much of the children that work in this industry, and then after they grow up, sometimes it can be unkind, and that's the tragedy of fame.
The bitter irony of Gary's life is that he will always be remembered for the one character he wanted to forget.
I don't think he ever said anything positive about those years on doing different strokes, to me. I think it was an ordeal for him. I think there was a sadness about it.
But for his friends and fans, Gary Coleman will always be the lovable Arnold Jackson.
I would love for Gary to be remembered as somebody who really entertained us and gave us hope on his show.
That's Gary's legacy. I think without question, he brought that to all of us, and that's the greatest gift that any entertainer or any human being can leave behind for us to cherish.